those pages. It's sci-fi or fantasy, whatever genre you please. And join a book club, 'cause you won't read it on your own. Join a book club, so you'll be held accountable. It's just a means to an end, but you're doing it with your friends. So join the book club by DLC.
Hello, book clubbers! I hope you're dancing in your seat. We got good reason to dance this week. We've got another sit-down interview with the author himself, Mr. Steven Erikson. But I'm here. I'm Jeff Kanata. I'm with Lana Bashinsky. Hi, Lana.
Hello. I am so excited. We love this book. Fans of the book, fans of the man. Can't wait to chat.
Well, let's get right into it. Bring him in. Start our interview for Book 5, Midnight Tides. Hey, book clubbers, we're excited to be joined once again by the author himself, Steven Erikson. Hello, Steven.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome back. We have completed the 5th novel of the Tales of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, Midnight Tides. So if you're watching this, assume spoilers for everything up through the end of Book 5. Needed to say that going in. And Steven, I want to start. My first question to you, having completed Midnight Tides, is Ersto who but?
Yeah.
Discuss.
It's I don't know. It's a product of the habit I have in terms of naming conventions, and I don't know if I can actually sort of map it out, but I sort of in my head I'll play around with just sort of smashing things together and seeing how it sounds, and I sort of picked up really early on that 3 syllables and then 2, or 3 syllables and 1 is actually quite memorable as a name. But for
putting
Ersto,
but in there is also pretty memorable.
Yeah, well, that's just it. Yeah, exactly. If you can throw in something that we kind of recognize in our language, that just sort of adds to it. But Ersto and like Ublala Pung, those kind of names. Once they sort of show up on, I handwrite them, and when they show up on the page, I just sort of, I think, okay, I've got that one, and I can build on that character, and something of the name conveys the character. I don't know how, but it does. So I already kind of know.
Ublala Pung definitely conveys that character.
Yeah.
Do you handwrite?
Exactly.
Do you handwrite like always your drafts, or just specifically the names?
No. I'm just names. I come up with lists of names. Once I realize, I need these characters in this setting or whatever, or this squad. I come up with names for squads and just go from there.
So do you have like a docket of names just like in the chamber ready to pull out that you like have an idea of what they are? No. Okay.
No. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I came up with, I had to fill out a squad. And it took about maybe 5 minutes at the most, but I had all 5 names, and they're so over the top that I don't even know if I can use them. So we'll have to see.
I need your strategy.
Who but? There's no over the top.
No, there's no over the top. No.
That seems like a very DM thing, because that's something I would do as a DM. Is like, just in case somebody needs to show up, I need to have a name that I can pluck right away.
Oh, I used to do that in gaming. Yeah. I'd have a half dozen names that I could pull out.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I need this strategy. I spend probably 2 hours on a character creator just trying to think of the right syllables and like tasting them for a while and being like, that's not her. But it is a trial. I love that you have a strategy for the coming up with names. So it was like this something that you realized you were doing so much that you were like, I have to now figure out something to make it easier for me because it's such a robust world with so many names? Or is it just that it was something you enjoyed, so you strategized around it?
I enjoy it. It's like drawing maps. I love maps, and I love coming up with city names and all the rest. And no, the character names, it's the most fun of the whole process, I think, in many ways.
that brings me to the question about pronunciation, because again, we keep stepping in it, and I feel so embarrassed every time I get one wrong. But do you have a sense when you're writing that people are going to get the pronunciation wrong, or is it a shock to you? Like the first time somebody said Malazan, we were like, "What? How could they?" Or did you know that was going to happen?
I had no idea. No, because I mean, Cam and I we both grew up in Winnipeg, so we had the same accents, and so we kind of do the same. The intonations and everything else is quite
the
similar.
Emphasis on the right syllable.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the questions I have to ask is, going into this, did you know that water was important to the book?
I'm afraid I did. Yes.
In all seriousness, you have so many beautiful metaphors for the sea, and there are times we're talking about people's relationship with the sea and sort of philosophically. Especially, there's some in the opening sequences, between the swish of the tides when giants knelt down and became mountains, or the Tarthanol view the seas as a single beast with countless limbs, including those that reach inland as rivers and streams. Were these things purely your various imaginings of different cultures and the relationship with this, or did you have inspiration from sort of grounded places that you drew from for these different relationships to the water?
I would guess it's a combination of both, I suppose, but probably more the former than the latter. So, like right now, I can't think of any readings I've done of in terms of other cultures and how they visualize and think of the sea or the symbol it represents for their culture. So it's probably more just working the metaphor. And, as you discovered, the elder god of the seas is intrinsic to the entire story. So water was going to be pretty important.
Yeah.
I knew definitely the whole time.
Well, you knew before me, that's for sure. One of the things that Lana and I love most about Midnight Tides is the humor. I mean, we already talked about Oobla Pung and Ersto, but you've got Tehol and Bug, of course, and Shirk and the Rat Catchers Guild. Obviously, there's funny characters and scenes in the previous novels as well, but I feel like there was more of it here, and maybe even more absurdist humor. And I'm wondering if you were ever worried about, this kind of grounded, realistic, enthralling world going too far into the humorous direction, or how did you feel about the balance of that?
No, that was just it. Because, I mean, I basically decided early on that this because it was very much of a standalone within the series. That I was going to be writing a Shakespearean tragedy, basically. And there's a very specific structure to that kind of tragedy, where you create a kind of an inevitability, and you have to build into that. You have to build slowly that inevitability, so that the choices the characters eventually make are all, they seem inevitable. That's the only choice they could have made. And so you're kind of narrowing these characters down as you go. But because I knew that everything was going to happen, it's going to close out as a throne room scene, very Shakespearean in that sense. I realized that I need to counterbalance that. And as dark as that was going to go, I needed to go the opposite direction. I know, I remember people have talked, and I've mentioned Worcester and Jeeves as an inspiration for Tehol and Bug. But actually, when I was thinking about it, it's more Hawkeye and Trapper John.
From MASH.
And the difference is they were both, there was no straight man between the two, right? They were both capable of amusing the other person. And that's Tehol and Bug, definitely. But that is also me and Cam as we gamed. So it's a callback to our gaming, was that we could amuse each other, and we did a lot. And it was, most of our gaming, for as dark as some of the subject matter happened to be, was more laughter than anything else. And so that was my callback to that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, it really needed to counterbalance the heaviness of everything else.
Did you find as the writer that you need those little breaths of the perspective shift as well? I feel like living in that heaviness, we hear so much about actors, their method, they really embodied that role for so long, it messed them up forever. But you're like writing dark themes, tragic themes, having those breaths of fresh air. Did you find, would you save those for times where you're like, okay, this is enough darkness on my soul for a while, time to hang out with Tay, Hole, and Bug?
Kind of, but this was okay. This novel wrote itself more than any of the other novels.
Wow.
I just felt like I was doing dictation basically, or stenography, I suppose. It was, and so as intricately plotted as it was, I didn't have many notes. It just sort of poured out. And so when that's happening, you have to trust your instincts. And because I was writing in a linear fashion, I started on page 1 and finished at the end of the book. My instinct would tell me this is the time for the break, and this is the time to go to Hole and Bug, or Shirk Alal, or whomever, or that crew, anyways. And I just had to trust that was the right timing for it.
I'm so envious of that. It's an amazing thing to even say that the book poured out like that. But you talked about it sort of being intricately plotted, and so many of these books that so far have dealt with this theme of convergence, where all these disparate elements are meeting at the end in this amazing climax. And it does feel like chess pieces moving across a board, getting to this big moment. And I wonder, do you start with that and work backwards, or do you have all these characters and then you're figuring out how they're going to play into the final convergence as you go?
It's a long time ago, but I think I had the throne room before anything else. That, or at least that was going to be the setting for it. But I mean, the genesis for the story came from a driving vacation in South Dakota, where we were stopping at various sort of roadside restaurants and that kind of stuff, gassing up and all that. And quite often there would be these big plaques on the corridors to the bathroom and all that kind of thing, or in the restaurant area of spear points and arrowheads and all the rest. And this was all, well, it was like 10,000 years worth of history, but the Lakota sort of became a major interest for me, because they were a nascent horse culture that was in its prime when it got cut down, basically, by the U.S. cavalry. So the Sioux Wars was one of my things I was thinking about prior to plotting out Midnight Tides. And the question I asked myself was, well, what would have happened if, for whatever reason, the Sioux Nation had been powerful enough to defeat the United States and to march on Washington and to put Sitting Bull on in the chair, the presidential chair? What would happen? And that was kind of the idea that I was mulling around and wanted to explore. So this is the first half of my response to that. This is Midnight Tides is getting us to that point of the ruler seating himself in the center of this vast nation. You're going to get to the other half later, but not yet. But then I realized I didn't want to do another plains or horse warrior culture, similar to the Wiccans or whatever. So I looked to the Northwest coast because I wanted a sedentary but fairly rich kind of cultural base. And of course, one of the first things about if you read up on the Northwest, like Haida, Salish, all of these cultures here, indigenous cultures, is that they were slave keeping cultures. So I realized that. I thought that would actually be a nice counterpoint to the indebtedness of Lether. So they're both economic functions, and so that's where I decided to hold on to that, that slave keeping.
Now
Warrior-based culture.
That inspiration point of, as you just were talking about, of indigenous cultures, and does that happen like as you're getting ready to write book 5, or does that happen in the sort of meta discussion of the entire series?
No, it was definitely getting ready for the books. I try not to think about the details of the books too far ahead. I wait until I finish the previous one, because then I've got all of the information I need that I know is relevant, and I can either everything about finishing House of Chains, it sets itself up as Charles Sangar is now going to tell his story. And so once I got to that point, then I had to think, well, okay, what kind of story is he going to tell? And that's when I start thinking about it. Yeah.
So for something like the drowning, I'm going to get the name wrong, of the Taistadur, is it Theridas? From Mail,
Yeah, it's Theridas.
Oh, Theridas.
Yeah.
So when you wrote Memories of Ice, and I think it's Whiskey Jack's crew, find that imploded body, did you know at the time that was like a male thing? Or are you just like, here's something that somebody can do later and they'll be like, whoa? Or like how much of that was a plan? Because that's 2 books back.
I know. As far as I recall, I knew I had to get to the Taistadur at some point. And I knew that the all the 3 Taist peoples, Leo, Sinadur, and Andy, all originated from one place. So I think what I did, and I could be wrong because it's been so long, but I think I threw him in there. I threw a character in there, just this body, has come from the deep, and then I guess I put a pin in it, and just kept it in mind. And then when we were getting towards the end of Midnight Tides, maybe before that, but then I realized, I know where he came from, and I know when. And it was just a question then of writing up to that scene.
Mm-hmm.
That's so cool. That's an alley-oop to yourself.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, I suppose.
So one of the things that I feel like the community talks about a lot is, we finish a book and they're like, the next book is even better, or like, just wait till book 7 or whatever. There's always somebody commenting on like, if you like this, just wait. While you were writing, did you have a sense or a desire that you were like one-upping yourself while you wrote? Or was this idea of like being bigger, more resonant, like this? Was there an awareness of like, oh, this book is even better than the last one? Or are they all sort of like, you don't have a favorite child, they're all your babies kind of thing? Was each book and like the escalation of them in this way a natural conclusion to the efforts of all this planning? Or were you like, we're going bigger, the next one, baby?
I don't know about bigger, because we talked about this last time, but when I got to the end of Memories of Ice, that was bulging at the seams in terms of going big. Mm-hmm. So I went the opposite with the next one. So I think by that point I realized I was setting a precedent of doing the unexpected with whatever I was going to be writing. But my experience at the time was, with each novel that came out, the initial response was quite often lukewarm or even negative. And that was certainly the case with Midnight Tides, and especially it was the case with House of Chains as well. The initial response was tepid at best. So I don't know if it was a sense of one has to believe that the work that you're working on at the time is the best. Is the best so far. If you don't have that belief, then you're kind of you're messing up your own process, if you will. So you have to believe. You have to believe even the character that you're happen to be writing, that point of view, that has to be your favorite character while you're writing that character.
Mm. So if I can sort of follow this train, like receiving that feedback once the book is released, what is sort of your approach to sourcing feedback while you're writing? Do you show people the plans? Do you wait till you have a whole first thing? And seeing that kind of response, well, I'll wait for I have a second half of that question.
Right. Well, the first half I had no advanced readers. I think that started up maybe by Reaper's Gale was when I sort of drew in a number of fans and other people like AP Canavan and stuff as my advanced readers. So up to that point, I was definitely writing in isolation. But yeah, it would be quite discouraging to sort of. There was a site called the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which was basically the only site discussing my stuff. And that's where the initial comments would come in as each book came out, and quite often they were fairly negative. So, but I knew where the series was heading, and I knew that I had to step on each of these stones in the stream to get to the other side. So I guess for whatever reason I had enough inner fire that I could hold off the damage that negativity could have done, and just kept going. So
that's exactly where the sort of second half of this question is. I could imagine that kind of response being really discouraging. So I know you've taught classes. Like, is there advice you give people who are writing and facing that? You're like, get your work out there and just take the hits as soon as you can, or like what would you advise people on who might be trying to follow in your footsteps?
The work you've just completed is no longer relevant. The work that you are working on now is the only thing that counts. So in other words, you have to leave it behind. You have to cut loose. You have to cut all ties from it, and move on. And so writing in that respect is constant forward momentum. And one way to sort of rationalize it is to think, well, the person who wrote that 6 months ago or a year ago, whatever, because it takes about a year for these books to come out, isn't the same person as sitting writing right now. And that that's their problem. You're now this other person. You've changed. And so yeah, you can't keep walking back over to that previous person. You can't walk backwards in this trail. You have to go forward. So you use that creative engagement to drive your momentum constantly forward, constantly going forward. And you don't have time to think about that person or the book that they wrote. You have only time and energy to invest in what you're doing right now.
Wow. It's been so interesting well, I won't speak for Lana, but for me, for the two of us to have entered into this thing so late, as you've mentioned a number of times, like, you wrote these a while back, and it's all new to us, right? As we're stepping into it. And then there's all this huge community of people that love these books and cherish these books. And sometimes I'll find myself, making this, what I think to be a very, observant comment on the work, and people are like, yeah, obviously we've noticed that years ago. But it seems like the books have only gotten a bigger audience relatively recently, right? In the last several years. Yeah. And I wonder if what you attribute that to. Is it simply because the series is done and now people are like, okay, it's done, I can go there now, or what do you think that is?
I think that's part of it, but also for whatever reason, that was increased. Well, I mean, BookTube sort of picked up and acquired some of its own momentum and started populating YouTube. So I think that played a huge role. But also, I did write with the intention of rereadability. I wanted this stuff to be able to reward readers second and third times around. So, so I guess in that sense, it was a bit of investment in faith, I guess, in the series. So it's I even noticed in one of the comments after your last session, somebody had listed all those places where I was hinting at who Mail was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So but of course that would never be for the first time reader. That has to be for the second time reader.
Well, even Troll Singar, like I want to go back and read every interaction that he has with Onrak because I feel like I know him better now. You know, it enriches that relationship and that familiarity that I have as the reader.
Yeah.
I love that that's something you thought about. It feels very resonant in games a lot. We think about replayability and giving people that fun loop and keeping them engaged. I feel like it's that specific rereadability is something I've not, I mean, not that I have like done that much digging into authors' mindsets, but it feels like, there's a non-spoiler topic that's sort of been sitting on the back burner for a while that I'm excited to talk about at some point, but ripe for a video game, this universe is. Yes, it's very resonant and exciting, and it feels so crazy to be like, oh, we'd get through all these 10 books, and I'm like, and then we start over? Like, is that what our plan is? Do we do the second read? It's fantastic.
Well, you've got Cam stuff. There's the Carcana stuff as well, and the novellas, Bokalin and Cobra Brooch. So no, you don't have to immediately rush into a reread. That's for sure. But I mean, the only thing I can guarantee is that it will be a different experience because you will be different, and your knowledge base will be different, and there'll be a sense of familiarity as you come back into the world, which is comforting. And so once you're comfortable on that level, then you can pick up all those subtle things that are going on, right? Because you've got the mental space free to do that. And that's very much short story writing. And that's what I learned. Short stories are meant to be reread many, many, many times.
So go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to just follow up on that. And that's because of the economy of what you're doing in a short story, the ability to sort of use more, do more with less, and so then on a reread you kind of see what you're doing with less. Yeah,
it's there's a kind of a density to the intent, not necessarily to the prose, but to the intention behind the prose. So at that sense, in that respect, because I write each scene as if it's almost a short story, or I write each chapter as if they're short stories. I have that in sort of those levels of intention that I'm playing with in the language. And the more I can pile onto that, the happier I am. So, and I guess because of that, it does lend itself to sort of the second pass by a reader and picking up things that they wouldn't otherwise. And, hopefully third pass and fourth pass. So
one of the things, I mean, Jeff and I have talked about it so much. These books have such strong themes and such, powerful moments that you've written in. Like times where we've read a chapter and we're like, I really want to highlight this whole thing and just read it and sort of experience it together. But it's like, I'll take a smaller chunk. You have these moments in the books that speak so resonantly and profoundly of a human experience, like an earthly experience. I know that we bring it back to sort of like the gaming experience a lot, like your adventures in the tabletop experience. And I know not everything in the books was born there, but are these themes, the sort of capitalism theme that we felt through Midnight Tides, the compassion theme that we felt through Memories of Ice, are these things you simply found within yourself that you were passionate about at the time?
Yeah.
Or were these things born of deeper discussions that you were having in your characters in this world?
I've always viewed every novel as a dialogue with the real world, regardless of whatever setting or genre you're in. So, I engage in that dialogue, and that's the novel. So, even though I was thinking about the Sioux Wars and that aspect of the storyline, the other thing I was thinking about a lot at the time was, I suppose, the British Empire, because emerging out of, well, it's quite complicated, but emerging out of the Renaissance and the rise of rationality, we then get to this, at least out of Europe, this age of exploration, which became colonialism. And all of that was very much economically driven. There were political stuff going on the European mainland, but economics, capitalism was driving colonialism. So that was what I wanted to engage in here, because I realized it was built in, right? You had an indigenous population that was being pressured by rapacious, capitalist-based civilization. And if that's going to be, sort of the bones of the story, then I might as well explore those themes as well. And so I pushed the Letheri to that extreme of capitalism, but actually more about debt, I think, than anything else. And ironically, I think this was before David Graeber's his fantastic book. I think it's 10,000 Years of Debt, a History, which was phenomenal. But that's kind of the heavier themes that I was messing around with there. And of course, slavery is part of that, right? Because even though, at least with the Taisadeur, there are political elements to the slavery, but it also is basically economic. It's you have a captive population to do the shitty work, but then you turn it over to the Letheri, and their form of enslavement is debt. It's the same thing. Yeah. And in many respects, we are still a slave society, even though we don't have slavery, because debt is the creepy glue that's holding everything together.
So I feel like it's one thing to sort of say like, oh, historically, these are the things that, like, here are the facts, but the emotion that these things are discussed with, the in this book, often tragic looks at these themes of death, of capitalism, of the experience of the slaves in these societies. Do you do a lot of inward looking, or once you are writing that character, you're like embodied? Because there's feels like a moral of the story, like in like the most trite way I could possibly put that. How do you reach that?
There's two elements to that, and I can respond by responding specifically to one of your fans who asked a question in the comments about the use of the F word. And I thought about that question because I thought, okay, that's actually a pretty interesting question, that it slowly works its way. And as viewer had pointed out, it does work its way more into the discourse of the novels as the series progresses. And I thought, well, why is that? And I think that's why there's kind of two levels to the answer. One is a meta. It's there's a meta element to this 10-book series. Should I define that, or is that good? Can I just say meta?
Yeah, no,
That's
I
good.
yeah,
Yeah,
got
that's
it.
good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And if I were to sort of visualize what that meta element was, it's as I progress in the series. Well, let's step back. Gardens of the Moon, if you were to balance the meta elements to it, of the intellectual versus the emotional, it's very much the intellectual. It's heavy on the intellectual in Gardens of the Moon, where I'm assembling all of these tropes to knock them down one by one, and that's an intellectual kind of exercise.
The tropes of traditional fantasy storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, they're not just tropes of traditional fantasy. They're tropes of, well, they're almost synonymous with archetypes, and so these things are being raised up and they're being knocked down. Just because I felt like it, I guess. But also, it sets the precedent of expectation that with the rest of the series, do not expect to find those tropes played out in a predictable fashion. So it's an intellectual setup for the rest of the series. But as the series progresses, the balance shifts. It moves away from the intellectual engagement to the emotional. And I think what's happening is by the time you get to Midnight Tides, I'm rising to the surface. Me as writer, as author, I'm slowly rising to the surface of these stories. And as we move into the 10 books, you're going to find I'm rising closer and closer to that surface. Until in the 10th book, I'm there on the surface. And so I think that was one meta element that actually plays into what this person was asking about. Because part of the emotional context is, quite honestly, anger. And I think, if I'm going to be writing about what I wrote about in Midnight Tides, that element of anger is finally going to start pushing to the surface. And with those swear words, it breaks. It breaks through, and then it submerges, and then it'll break through again. So I think that's what was going on.
It's a beautiful answer and really insightful. Is that something that just happened? That's just something that was natural because as you're investing in the reality of this world, your own emotional ties to those themes are erupting.
Yeah, and whatever psychological progress, if it is progress or exploration, anyways, that was going on a personal level. I mean, that was 11 years. Basically, the midlife. Gardens of the Moon got published when I was 41, so it is that midlife. And the reason why this is all kind of sort of front and foremost in my mind right now is I've had somebody contact me a few years back, saying he wanted to do a Jungian analysis of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. And I said, that sounds cool. Let me know when you got it done. And I was expecting, I don't know, maybe 30-page essay or something. Well, he finally finished and he sent it to me. It's a 483-page book.
Wow.
And I just finished reading it. And it's going to be coming out. It's not quite ready, but it will be print on demand. I think it's called Fall and Ascent. And
Fall and Ascent, is that what you said?
Fall and Ascent.
Oh, Fall and Ascent.
And so part of that Jungian analysis is both relative, based or focused on the characters within the stories, but also on the meta, the author. And he's balancing the two. I mean, he doesn't know that much about me, but he's reaching certain conclusions that I recognized as he was going. So it's foremost in my mind right now. And that's why when I got to that question about the swearing, everything fit into place. And I could give you the answer I just gave you.
Wow. So in reading that, did you feel like he got to some truth about your
Absolutely. Yeah. And it was extraordinary. And he basically devoted, I guess, one section to each novel, and they were extensive.
Well, I'm excited to read it. That's wonderful.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
but it's a companion piece. You have
Yeah.
to know the series in order to.
Yeah.
In order to.
No, I'm
be
excited
able
to read
follow
it in 2 years when we finish.
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
So speaking of all this stuff, it occurs to me that, you know, in many stories, not just fantasy stories, but stories in general, there are characters that exist simply to be functional, to be an impediment to the hero, for example, or just sort of it's not their story. They're just here to be a utilitarian object. But so frequently in your novels, or in these novels, your characters, even the small ones, even the seemingly insignificant characters, have a humanity, a depth, and often are given a catharsis that seems larger than their status in the book.
Yeah.
And I want to know if that is something that you imposed on yourself, you forced yourself to do, or is it something that comes natural? Or explain to me that concept, please.
Well, it's a response to my rejecting the premise that, and that's where I disagree with AP. For example, he talks about characters as plot functions, story functions. When I was first starting out, I was handed a number of books by John Gardner on moral fiction, on becoming a novelist, and his take was very much along the lines of one has to treat each character you create with the dignity they deserve. And so they're not simply, in a sense, structural plot functions or utilitarian in any respect. You have to view them as living, breathing human beings. And so that complexity is built in. As soon as you think in those terms, you cannot just have the character step on stage to deliver their lines and then walk off again, having done their function. No, they're actual. Actual. They're not actual, but one thinks of them as actual people. And once that happens, then all the sides of their lives sort of are available to be focused on. And it's almost as if I feel that they deserve that much at least for whomever they are. And that allows me to engage on an emotional level with their point of view and their stance and their lives. And even though we only see just a sliver of it, just a small fraction of it, that doesn't make it any less complete as a life. It's just we're peeking in. We're seeing this little scene, which can only be a few lines or a few paragraphs. But I would like the sense that even having left them, at least the reader has a sense that their lives go on.
So. Yeah, I mean, I think of, for example, Oobla Pung, who's, you know, basically a dick joke for a large portion of the novel, and you know, it's great. I very much enjoyed it, and then he has this beautiful, poignant, sweet moment at the end, and you're like, oh my gosh, he's not just this two-dimensional character. Or Chalice, who is the slightest of slight characters, insignificant by any measure, and then has this incredibly selfless, beautiful moment at the end. I'm struck by how you're able to have such a large tapestry of characters and then find moments for even the smallest of them to be resonant. Mm-hmm. I guess that's just a compliment, not a question.
Do you have like a favorite? Has there ever been one that you wrote that was this perfect little example of this life that you created that you're like, that I liked that. I like that one. This one was my favorite. If I were to come back and I'd write something about it, it'd be about this little guy here.
All the time. And I have to stop myself because, I could go in those directions, but you've got one coming in well, not the next novel, but the one after, who sort of was originally just thrown up there as a squad member, who then I realized required a little bit more, and that becomes a fairly impactful little lengthwise. If you were to put all of his scenes together, it's not much, but it's still there was enough there, I think, to get the reader engaged. So
you have one?
I do. This one,
yeah, go ahead.
it's sort of tied in with like a character that's definitely present, but not. Comes from the Discord from Pernicious Pumpernickel. Steve has said multiple times that Midnight Tides is a tale of two sets of three brothers. Why does he hate Vinidas? And was it planned from the start that Vinidas would not be in the book much to make parallels between the Sengars and the Bedics more obvious?
It may have been the case that one extra character developed in depth would have been one too many. There were quite a few to begin with. And I guess for whatever reason, his role just it fell away in the writing of the story, became less relevant. Whereas characters like Saren Pedak just sort of pushed their way into the forefront, and you just have to let that happen, right? So,
yeah,
it strikes me hearing you talk about this novel in particular, and I think the series as a whole, but this novel in particular as a tragedy. It strikes me in recontextualizing it that way, or at least thinking about it that way, how many tragedies are in the novel. Like it's, you think of Romeo and Juliet, and I guess Mercutio has a tragedy and Tybalt has a tragedy, but it's really about Romeo and Juliet's tragedy, right? Whereas in this novel, obviously Roulad's a tragic figure. Trolsengar at the end, with him unable to literally just say, "I like you. Can we be, can I give you my sword?" But there's Hull Bedik is a tragic character who's not exactly the main thrust of the novel. It feels like there's tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And the fact that you mine that so many times, I mean, even Baruch the Pale is like this very tragic figure. Over and over and over, you find that happening.
And I think by this point, I was thinking these aren't fantasies with tragic elements. These are tragedies with fantastic elements. So it kind of flipped. But I figured I'd go all in on this one because the social structures are the things that basically created the tragedies in the lives of these characters. And that strikes me as, in many respects, as the most realistic and the most our world side of things. And then in artistic terms, tragedy has kind of fallen away. In the Aristotelian sense, there's an aversion to it. I'm aware, for example, that a number of films on first screening to their select audience that had tragic endings, everybody got so upset that they insisted upon a happy ending, and so they had to reshoot and do things all over again. So tragedy felt like it was slowly sort of disappearing from the landscape of literature, and yet I found some of the most affecting works to be the tragic works, whether it's, I think, Saving Private Ryan as a film, right? I mean, that extremely powerful tragedy. And yet there does seem to be a general aversion to that kind of story. So by this point, I was thinking, oh no, I'll go all in on this one, and I'll set it up so that the system is the one that actually is the destroyer of these characters, on both sides. And so once you, I guess, sort of reach that thinking in terms of how to approach the story, then it's not as difficult to create those moments. And those are the ones that are perhaps the closest to our world, and the tragedies that we coexist with all around us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Udnas, Brice Benedict, the list goes on. And I guess the answer really is the system. Once you decide the system is going to be of tragic results, it affects everybody. And that's very powerful.
Yeah. The setting up of like the start of Roulad's tragedy was again, I'm just like rolling through with just a compliment. No question, really. From seeing Udanas do the first body preparation,
Mm-hmm.
and then just being like, man, that was quite a task. And it's like spooky because the women are chanting, and it, like, you set it up that it's this laborious thing, all these coins, we don't care about coins, we use them to bury our dead, whatever. And being like, yeah, interesting little glimpse at their culture. And then Roulade comes back, and like, as soon as he came back and he's got that sword, I'm like, oh no, he's gonna go through the thing. Like the moment that they're like, Udna, start doing your thing, I have never so viscerally felt like not only like this, like the spookiness, it like turns into a horror chapter through that moment where he's covering in wax and stuff like that. The physicality of like how sort of gruesome and gut wrenching that was, leading into like how tragic it is and him getting lost, and like how like he's the annoying little brother, and then spinning into like that sympathy that you feel for him, but he's still kind of a jerk. It's like, I just must say that everything about that was like the physical and emotional manifestation of tragic in that character, from the way he's left high and died to his brothers. I just loved it. It was truly some of the most enjoyable chapters from my pure immersion in that moment, and how my husband was sitting next to me like, are you okay? I'm like, you gotta catch up, you gotta read this chapter. As it was just so tense and so excellent. And I guess I'll spin it into a question I did have, which is that feeling of immersion that you create in your books. I feel so sucked in. I feel immersed in this world. I feel like the details that you give are giving me all I need to be there without dipping into like, it's a book about self-insertion. This is you. You're in the book now. This is who you can pretend to be in your brain. Was that how do you do that? Do you feel like there's a difference? How do you do that?
How is so
good? why books so good? But is that specific like level of immersion versus self-insertion? Are those different concepts, and were you specifically trying to avoid people having the reader sort of surrogate in there, or what was did you think about that immersion level while you were writing?
No. Although having said that, I think part of my writing process is to immerse myself completely into the scenes. So the response of Udanas to Roulad's awakening, I guess at some point I would have asked myself, well, how would I have responded to that? And Udanas was definitely a character that was just taking on more import in me, because in a sense he was kind of an everyman character, but only in the sense of we're all basically enslaved to a system, like right here in this world, and it seems to be a headless one. So it's just this momentum and this built-in structure that impedes the spiritual growth of everybody. And so I guess to some extent, I would have fully identified with Udanas in that situation. And then I just have to trust that I wasn't going to twist it in the sense that I didn't want to turn Udanas into a particularly nasty character. I sort of great sympathy for his position.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess because of what I just said, that was kind of a self-sympathy for the thing. So so I had Udenas respond the way I would have responded, and just left it at that. And then, so I guess in many respects, there is a bias within the story, in the choices that the characters that I most identified with made throughout that story. And then for the characters that who are the opposite, just by virtue of what I would have done, I could imagine the opposite of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a starting point, and then to take those characters in that direction.
It is interesting to think of Udenas in that context, because at the end, after the Wyval has used him and destroyed his body, he comes up and says, "Hey, can I have some of your blood? I want to." He did not deserve any of this, and I could sort of transpose the author saying, "This character just did not deserve any of this. He deserves to have something good happen to him at the end."
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So I love the idea of justifying undead in a fantasy story with a city that just doesn't have any place for the dead people to go. Like there's no hold of the dead, so there's no place for them to go.
Yeah,
I think that's genius. But also, it occurred to me that some of the things that you're playing with regard to these undead characters, the Utulu, for example, and Harlist's joy at just wanting to be scary, and those felt like very much like tabletop role playing. It's like, if I'm going to be an undead character, I want to be super scary. Is there any of that? Is there a story behind either of those two things in particular?
No, I don't think so. But yeah, I always thought that sort of undead characters in fantasy are given short shrift in terms of their personalities. Do you remember there's a Richard Corbin film called The Raven? Have you seen that film?
I don't think so.
No, with Boris Karloff and Vincent Price.
No, I don't think I have.
And Peter Lorre, who plays the Raven. So it's based on the poem. It's crazy. But anyways, there's one scene that I just absolutely adored, and it's where the Vincent Price character visits the burial chamber of his father, and his father's lying he's dead, the father, and he's lying skeletal, almost skeletal, in the coffin, and the Vincent Price character comes up really close to him to give him a blessing or to whatever. And the corpse goes up and grabs him by the throat, by here, and pulls him down and whispers, I can't remember what he whispers, something like, beware, something along those lines, and then just falls back dead again. And I remember seeing it and bursting out laughing because it was such a terrifying, this moment of terror, and then nothing, just beware. And then he just falls dead again. But if you think of that scene, and if you kind of deconstruct it, there's a whole interiority to what that dead character was saying that obviously did not show up, but it only showed up as grabbing his son and warning him. But what was the interior world of that undead character to drive him to come back from the dead and warn his son? So that kind of stuff always intrigued me. And I know when I was playing around with the Tregal Trade Guild, and quite often they would go through Hood's realm. I don't know if that's happened yet, but anyways, and they tend to pick up undead on the way, clinging to their wagon. So I guess I just wanted to mess around a little bit more with that. And Shirk-Alau was certainly one of those cases of someone who, despite being dead, has retained her vanity in some respect.
Right.
And so that became, well, then I had to figure out, well, how can I biologically make any sense at all? And then that's where the notion of a symbiont came into being.
It's so cool because you take these things that, like you said, are established tropes. We nobody's going to question if you throw an undead, character in there. We know what that is. We read fantasy novels. I get it, but it's like a layer deeper of analysis of what's that really like, and it's the same thing with the demons in this novel, where of course we just pluck a demon from wherever they come from and use them, and they're demons, and who cares? Oh, wait a minute. I just got an error message. Problem saving local backup of audio. It still seems like it's going, though.
It looks, I've got green check marks, and it looks like it's rolling over here.
So we could pluck the demon from their place and use them for what we want, and nobody would think about it. And if you put that in the novel, nobody would think about it. But the fact that there's a deeper level of analysis of like, well, where do they come from, and what do they think about it? It's so... I love that second layer of thinking of, well, no, let's analyze this concept and really, think about it.
Part of it probably came out of the gaming, but also I think I stumbled on it in a sense in Gardens of the Moon when the demon Pearl is summoned to fight Rake, Animander, and he has that little conversation with Quickben, or something along the lines of "pity me," as he heads off. And I think something about that I decided to hold on to because it felt kind of cool and surprising that a demon would respond that way. So because it comes from a gentle place. And then I thought, okay, well that's interesting to then maybe we can sort of explore that in more detail. So that's where these demons are appearing, and they didn't welcome the abduction, and,
right.
And they had their lives.
So yeah, and it plays into that slavery theme that's happening. There's different versions of it that play out in this novel, and the compassion too is that Troll actually has compassion for these things that no one else has compassion for.
No.
Yeah. Well, there's you have the segment where you sort of talk about demons. It's like, what are demons really? There's something that has come from somewhere that is not the place that we are familiar with. And that kind of sort of take on it versus like a thing that's there to do my bidding, or like a thing that should be slain and is evil, is like, no, it's something having a time that is at odds with the time that I am familiar with. And it's great.
The kind of along the same lines, you have this wonderful knack for coming up with these just almost throwaway backstories that I'm so jealous of, because they just such brilliant little encapsulate. I'm thinking of, for example, Shirk's backstory about she threw the landlord out the window, which would have been fine, except that he landed on somebody else, and and she gets tossed in the river, which would have been fine because the fish only eats males, but she got caught on the thing. All of those little smaller backstory things. Can you explain the process? Are you sitting at your word processor going, okay, I need a backstory for that character? Or, I mean, at what point does that stuff happen? Is that in the process of creating the character? Because it often feels like a little diversion. We're just going to tell you a little bit about it. And it almost invariably is this brilliant, tiny little moment of unexpectedness.
Well, that's what I'm looking for because I generally invent that on the fly, but I'm looking for the unexpected in whatever scenario I'm going to come up with. I guess I don't know if I can give any sort of more.
Just happens. You just able to do it.
Yeah. Well,
Amazing.
Here's a question from OTV Bob. Well, there's two. A, why books so good? And then B is, does Steven enjoy writing brand new characters or settings like Midnight Tides more, or revisiting the characters from previous books?
They're different, but I do enjoy coming up with new characters and new scenarios. But that harkens back to the earliest parts of anyone's sort of writing experience if they become a writer or are becoming a writer, and that is beginning scenes, opening chapters. Are always the most fun because it's the blank page in front of you and you can create anything you want. And the further you go into the scene, the more doors of potential are closing. So it starts getting harder at that point. So creating new characters and new scenes is in many respects the easiest part, I think, for any writer. Just to open a scene on a page. And then, it gets harder later. But then if you've been with that character for a long time and you're coming back to them, there's a sense of familiarity that you can rely on. And so, and that's fun to return to as well.
Do you feel like a nostalgia when you're
Yeah.
writing in someone's voice? Like, oh, I remember Whiskey Jack. Let's talk.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's easier to fall back into certain voices than others. Mm-hmm. So Iskerl Pust or Krupp or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I realized, Lena, that our first couple of interviews with Mr. Erikson were,
Steve,
very, I think, very insightful. And now I realize I'm just a fanboy going like this part.
I know.
Like that part.
I know.
Remember that part? It was so good. I'm like that Chris Farley character on Saturday. You're awesome. How awesome are you? Anyway, I'll try to be more professional. Luckily, we have some listeners that have questions too.
But also, Lana, I did notice you writing a lot of questions down over all the sessions. Have you gone through them all, or?
I write a ton of questions. Some of them I write, and then through your answers, you organically answer other ones that I would have asked. So I would say overall, yes, some of the ones I've carried over, and some of them are more like we've had silly ones in the past. It would take me longer. I'm very bad at the multitask of reading and speaking at the same time. And so it'd take me longer to dig them up right now than not. One of the questions I did have, though, is something that Jeff and I talked about during one of our non-spoiler chats, was we've talked about our experiences of reading. So, for instance, when I read, I often find myself internalizing words and especially names as more of symbols of communication rather. Whereas Jeff has told me that he hears more of a rhythm and more of the words in his head as he reads. What is your experience as a reader, and how do you think that your reading experience has affected the way that you write?
It's completely messed up. No, and it's I'm still working on a book on writing. And it's one of the earliest. The warning that I give as early as I possibly can in this book is, once you learn to read as a writer as opposed to read as a reader, it's going to fuck things up. I mean, there's I don't know how else to put it, but it's like your potential for just pleasure and enjoyment has now diminished dramatically, because you may see some of the more awkward bones of sentence structure or scene development. So if you've learned about narrative structure and all of those elements, when you see it well done, it's wonderful. You can admire it and steal from it, of course. Mm-hmm. But when it's badly done and it happened to have been a favorite book of yours when you were 10 years old, it really sucks, right? Because that nostalgic pleasure, you then have to separate that out from the actual quality of the work itself. And they're equally valid, but it becomes problematic to go back to read early stuff that you absolutely adored. Because you're messed up now. You're seeing different things. And that, it's a way, I basically realized that I have to disengage the nostalgic aspects of my experience growing up and reading, and separate that from the quality of the writing itself in those works.
So are there things that when you're reading particularly stick out to you? Like you got your top 10 pet peeves of somebody else's writing? Like hit me with a couple. No,
I don't really have pet peeves. I guess I'm making an effort to be more forgiving. No, I know it sounds arrogant, but it isn't. It's we're all, I mean, even in life, we're all doing the best we can. And even if something is awkwardly written or whatever, I can still see the great enthusiasm and joy that the writer took in telling their story. And that has to count for something. At least in my mind, it does. And so that's what I kind of hold on to as opposed to the other stuff. I was thinking actually of writing an essay on the necessity to take nostalgia out into the courtyard in front of a firing squad and kill it.
Yeah, nostalgia sort of outsized in our culture now.
It's pernicious because it imposes. Well, first of all, it's a romanticized recollection of the past. So once it's romanticized, it's not bound to the real world anymore. And to then view every reiteration of a story or adaptation of a story on the basis of your romanticized nostalgic memory of that original story is the worst position you can possibly be in, because nothing will satisfy you, because nothing can match that romanticized memory that you have of these things. But if you can separate that from the work itself and just say, well, there's another generation waiting to be caught up in this storyline, and however it's been changed and brought up to date, they have the right to do so. And to have all of you lining up to trash the latest version of He-Man or whatever, it's not your place, because you're not the intended audience. So get out of the fucking way.
Yo, that is what you're saying. I have some game studios that should really, if you put an essay together, I know some former employers that I would send that off to real fast, real fast. It is the idea of like moving forward and innovation.
Yeah.
I remember talking once to a band I really liked. I ended up running into them after I saw the concert, and they were talking about how they were so frustrated just because people only want them to play the hits, play the old ones that got them into it. And they're like, we wrote those when we were 15.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't hit us the same way.
No.
And embracing that next gen and innovating, not just like with technology or like mechanics or story, but just letting yourselves feel what is more resonant to what's happening now and for people in the future. Chef's kiss, baby, chef's kiss.
Well, do you have anything that you have watched or read or experienced lately that has particularly struck you as excellent?
Nothing is immediately coming to mind, but it's not because there isn't good stuff out there. It's just when I'm focused on, when I'm closing in on the end of a novel, the outside world disappears completely for me, because I need to be as immersed in that as possible. So, I don't really think there's much that I've sort of been looking at lately. No, nothing's Nothing's jumping out at the moment.
Yeah.
We do have a couple more questions from Discord that I'm going to pull us back to. From the one who took Tay Hall's blanket. I'm not sure how to word my question, but what does Tay Hall's friendship represent thematically for Bug? I've been thinking on it for a while now recently, but I'd love to know what Steven takes from their what Bug takes from their companionship.
Wow. Okay. Let's go fully metaphysical here, shall we? Imagine that you could put speakers to all of the internal chatter of every consciousness on the planet. And that would be like 9 billion people. Put speakers on all of that so that we all can hear this oceanic roar of internal chatter. And now imagine having to live through that for not just a single lifetime, but 1,000 years, 10,000, 500,000. At some point, you're going to want to disengage or you'll be driven completely mad. I mean, we would be driven mad almost instantly, I think, if we were somehow able to, or rather unable to filter out the psychic chatter surrounding us. Just walking down a street, for example. So, of course, I can see Bug doing precisely what he does. To disengage from that and to step back down into the real world, and to establish a quasi-normal one-on-one relationship with somebody. That strikes me as almost the only option for an entity of that longevity, I think. So, and clearly they entertained each other. And yet there's a level of self-awareness to both of them. Even though, I mean, even the exercise that Tahol engages in recognizing that, none of these meals that Bug is cooking should be sustaining in any fashion whatsoever. But then just shrugging and saying, yeah, I'm not going to question this any further. There has to be a sense of self-awareness that, yeah, something unusual is going on here, but let's just roll with it.
So are they really eating garbage, or is Mail doing it's just shoe,
who knows?
But it's also
who knows, right?
That's why I love it. We talked about this.
It's for them to know.
It sounds like you can almost read every interaction that they have that they're doing a bit with each other. They both know that they're doing a bit, but they're committed to the bit. I love it.
Yeah, that's precisely it, and just that notion of just running with it, that's in many ways that's a lot what the television series of MASH was doing, right? It framed everything in this tragic, dysfunctional scenario and situation.
War.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yet it could find, similar to Catch-22, it could find the absurdity of life. And then, the characters were simply engaged in that absurdity without end as their defense mechanism. So in that respect, the absurdity coexisted between Bug and Tahol is Bug's self-defense to that psychic chatter. And it's certainly Tahol's as well. And they're both aware of it. And, why fix what isn't broken?
Mm-hmm. The comedy is so excellent. Do you feel like you have a Tahol type 5 that he'd go up at like the local saloon and do? Like, do you practice the comedy, or is it
it's got to be spontaneous, and more often than not, it is linguistically based. Style comedy. Occasionally, obviously, I do go into the more physical slapstick style stuff, but quite often that's related to action of some form or another.
Yeah. What's his name? Our friend from the last book who kept not dying, falling into the horse. I can't remember his name, but he was one of my favorites too.
Korab.
Yeah.
Korab, that's right.
Yeah, and that's just great fun to write. You're trying to write your way to keep the guy alive, and so you invent one thing after the other. Yeah, it's good fun.
So to go a little away from the world of Malazan for a second, I wrote one question down here that I don't remember what I actually wrote, but I did write willful child books ?
Mm-hmm.
We were so lucky to have our little moment of reading the script.
Oh right, yeah, that was
which
fun.
was excellent.
Yeah, we loved it.
Is the sort of the comedy level through those books like higher on average? Was it like time
those
to
are parody
detox?
books, right?
They're full parody the whole time.
It's full parody. Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
We got to read those next.
I know.
They will be about as opposite to the Malazan Book of the Fallen as you can imagine.
Yeah.
But again, it was my love of Star Trek, the original series, and asking myself what would happen if you had a starship captain whose only source of inspiration and knowledge was James T. Kirk, and just take it from there.
So thinking about every side character is not like just a plot device to keep things moving.
Mm-hmm.
Is it like every red shirt when they die? I know that they are. I know that they've got a family back home. Or
well, no, because I think I just finished Willful Child when Scalzi's Red Shirts came out.
Oh,
that was a fun book to read.
I enjoyed that book too.
Yeah. But the point I wanted to make actually is that nobody dies in the Willful Child. There are no red shirts.
About as opposite is right.
Yeah. But there are some characters, I think, who ultimately experience a demise of some form or another. But primarily for your main crew on the ship, Willful Child, nobody dies, and that's Hadrian's rule, is that nobody's allowed to die while he's captain. So.
That's a good rule.
Good. It's like more people should make that rule.
You would think, wouldn't you? Yeah,
you would.
So I got another question here. The one who took Tejal's blank as a couple. This is one, somebody who didn't die but had a bit more tragedy. Hull Bedict. Hull Bedict's story is a tragic one, and so often in the story we emphasize with him.
Empathize, I think.
Empathize with him and how his life's work was used against him, and even worse, resulted in the subjugation of groups like the Narek. However, through the story, we start to see how his vengeance started to get out of hand, and even worse, it almost became self-serving and does not ever address actually helping the Narek like Tejal actually does. Is Hull a critique on the hero's journey, and how much of it is self-serving?
Yeah, I think it is very much a critique on the hero's journey. But it's also historical in the sense that quite a few early period ethnographers and ethnologists ended up their work got subverted. Their knowledge base of peoples that they visited got subverted for not particularly good reasons. And so there is that aspect as well, and where your intentions are honorable, I suppose, and drawn from a sense of wonder and excitement about the human condition, and to have that turn on you by the structure and the authority of the society you're in is the greatest betrayal of all. And there was, I remember in my undergraduate in anthropology, there was a professor at the University of Manitoba. I don't know if I should give too many details, but anyways, he had been studying coca trade routes in South America, and all of his data got basically confiscated. I think it was by some equivalent of the CIA, and because it was coca leaves, right? So he was from that point on. So all his time teaching, he was a broken man, and whenever he got to describe that in his class of what happened, he would just break down in front of the class. So, and that's, it sounds awful, but archaeologists and anthropologists were quite often funded and asked to do sort of things that had nothing to do with their discipline and their science. So it is one of those, one of those cases where, all your reasons for doing something end up becoming not relevant. And the internal crisis that occurs there is pretty fundamental, I would think.
It's a character that I think I said this a number of times during our read-throughs. It's a character that felt like it could support its own novel. Like Hull's story could be a novel, and he's not even, I think, in my top 8 favorite characters in this novel. So is there any push and pull there for you of the richness of a character sort of just being a side part of something, or how do you know? I guess that's the wrong question, but
no, I get it.
Yeah,
but I think because this novel wrote itself to such a degree, when I started out and I had Hull, I thought Hull was going to be a major character in the book. Because as you're right, I mean, there's a huge backstory to that.
Yeah.
But it stayed in the background, and I guess by this point, I'd learned not to force it, and not to, question that, to just let it flow. And this novel flowed like I say, like nothing else I'd written or written since. Well, maybe my first contact novel, Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart. That one flowed as well. But this one was just, I think I wrote it in 3.5 months.
Man.
Holy
I know.
moly.
I know.
And you said, no, like you didn't do like a feedback loop. You like wrote it in 3 months and you're like,
yeah.
hey,
Yeah.
get it on
and
the
start
shelves.
to finish. And like you started page 1 and ended the end.
Yeah.
It's
Whew.
crazy.
Yeah. I know. Bit uncanny, that one.
It's that's an amazing thing. I'm so again quite jealous. That's
I mean, I sure as hell couldn't do it now. It was just, I guess, something felt like it was at its peak, and it just went. So,
was there something that was happening in the world around you that, like, I mean, with Jeff and I talked a lot about like the strong ties to capitalism, and we're like, Lether is like America, right? That's what we're feeling. Those are the vibes British Empire, our perspective while we were going through it, because of like what's happening in the world around us now, is like still resonant with America's,
if not more so,
politics. So was there anything that was happening in the world that made it like, I got to tell this story now because of those like ties, or is it just your connection to history and your study that floated out?
Yeah, not that I recall. More only on a more personal level. The like I say, the trip we took to South Dakota was pretty interesting in how it basically became the fertile soil, I guess, for Midnight Tides. We were at a couple of museums there. The capital of South Dakota is called Pierre, although it's actually Pierre, because it was the French fur traders were moving through that area, La Vérendrye brothers, among others. And I think around that time, this actually might, somebody can check this, but I mean, if they're really, pedantic, I think it was the anniversary of Lewis, the two explorers that went west.
Lewis and Clark?
Yeah,
Lewis and Clark.
Yeah.
Not even American.
Not even American. Look at you. Well,
Yeah.
you both
Got
know
it. We got one.
I'm the minority American over here.
Yeah.
Anyway, go ahead.
And so it was being celebrated. And certainly it was being celebrated at the museum in Pier. And so it got me thinking, because it's myth making, right? That story of Lewis and Clark is entirely myth making. And there's in fact, the details of it are, conveniently set aside for the myth.
Yeah.
So they were working off of Mackenzie's maps. Mackenzie had already done it. He was a Scottish-Canadian explorer. So it was no new ground that was being covered there at all. But the function of the myth was all about, the formation of America. And I guess that got me thinking in terms of how history is so easily revised in order to serve other functions, rather than just a recording of facts. It has to do with self-identity. So that stuff was definitely foremost in my mind around that time, and I suspect, it wove its way into the writing of Midnight Tides.
I mean, I think there was a section that we read at the end of one of the episodes that is almost directly speaking to that, with the notion of, the details don't matter. It's the idea. It's the myth. It's the, I think there was somebody was talking about Lethrus and saying, our power is in the idea that we are unstoppable. And if whatever the details of wins or losses or who did what or what doesn't matter, because the great sweep of time. Yeah. So very, very directly about that.
So, yeah. And like I say, I write a novel sort of engage in a dialogue with the present, whatever year that may have been. So I think that was kind of part of what I was thinking about, for sure. Was that myth making?
Do you ever feel melancholy in these words that I wrote so long ago, thinking about history? Jeff and I are reading. We're like, dang, sure feels like today.
Yeah, melancholy. Yeah, I mean, one can feel, but it's more to do with age than anything else. It's just a weariness, and I guess a concern in the polarity that's increasingly present. But also, I mean, historically, one can come up with a fairly extensive list of characteristics preceding the fall of a civilization, and we're kind of ticking them all off. We're just checking them off.
Well, good night, everybody.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, that can be discouraging for sure.
Well, one of the things that I'd love to ask, because one of the questions I didn't read from Skinny Pippo, which was about the historical events that maybe have been inspiration for the writing process of Midnight Tides or any of the previous novels. And you have these locations that you've been to that sort of infused you with the inspiration. Is there a place for people who want to sort of dive more into those inspirational spaces for you that you'd recommend that people should go to sort of infuse themselves with the history that is the foundation for some of your work here?
I think, it'd be different for everyone, but I think the key is to open yourself to the places that you visit, and completely open yourself. Even if that entire visit is inside a city, there is so much within that city. And as a traveler, you have an outside perspective, you have an alien perspective, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. That I mean, you'll observe things and see things that will be striking, um, but then it's what are you going to do with what you see and what you observe? And for me, the exercise then is to turn around and look back at my culture, my civilization, and my experience, and then to try to work out, well, what's the significance of the differences between these two things, and how does that point to some commonality of the human condition? It sounds really airy-fairy, but I think that idea of really being present in a place as an observer rather than participant is one of the curses of the artist, I think, especially the writer. We're always on the outside looking in. John Gardner, I think, in one of those books, when he describes writers, he says, imagine a party where everybody's standing in the corners looking at everyone else. And that's basically the writer.
Well, that seems like a beautiful place to end things, actually. As we all stand in the corner, hopefully, we're present, and I'm certainly appreciative of being able to step through these novels in such detail and then be able to talk about them with you. Thank you again for being with us and being with us repeatedly. Very excited to start our journey through Bone Hunters next. I think we're going to have 1 week off between now and starting, but we will jump right into Bone Hunters. And are there any pronunciations I need to be aware of, Steven, in Bone Hunters?
That's a good question. No, I think you'll have covered that ground. I think
I'll have already made the mistakes.
I can't wait to surprise you with how much we can make you cringe.
Yes. No, one thing I wanted to say was how appreciative I am of your analysis and your discussions of these books. But also, you guys bring laughter. You bring laughter to this, and that is such a rare thing. And I look forward to it every week. And I'm really pissed off that I'm not going to be able to see anything this upcoming week. But I'll be there afterwards. So,
well, thank you. That means you have no idea how much that means to us, and we can't help but laugh because we're goofballs. That's what we are.
Absurdity
we're mirroring. We're mirroring. We're balancing the gravitas with the comedy.
That's right.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's our last refuge, isn't it?
Indeed. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.